You're listening to the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Hello? Is that the famous astronomer, Sir Patrick Moore?
It is, very much so.
Any news on the space front?
Quite so. Elon Musk has just designed and developed 5 gigantic, state-of-the-art rocket ships. All members of Parliament, along with the American Senate, have first-class tickets aboard them, you see. They're told they're going to the moon.
Told? Where exactly are they going, Sir Patrick?
The new anomaly discovered recently astronomically. A huge black hole.
Welcome to Twin Souls. Twin Souls is brought to you in association with the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Your host, Philip Kinsella. Now, our guest today is none other than Paul Blake-Smith. Now, Paul is an author of quite a few non-fiction books on UFOs, and he also holds a 4-year mass communications degree with a minor in English from Southeast Missouri State University. He's written, as I said, 5 other books on extraterrestrials, contact and cover-ups, and he resides in his hometown in the Midwest, where he continues his exploration and research. And I have to tell our listeners that when I bought a copy of Paul's new book, President Eisenhower's Close Encounters, I was literally blown away with the amount of research and the work that he'd done on this project. And it really is a must, a historical document, because he's done his research. And I'll just explain a little bit about the book before we bring Paul on. How do US presidents avoid global panic? Create a secret agreement with visiting extraterrestrials. This well-researched non-fiction book will give you a detailed, logical look at the most exciting presidential saga ever. Follow along with researcher-author Paul Blake-Smith as he pieces together an explosive puzzle which reveals that President Eisenhower met with friendly aliens and that other American presidents likely renewed Ike's secret agreement with the visitors to remain aloof to this day to avoid triggering social chaos. Hello, Paul. How are you?
I'm doing just fine, and thanks for having me on the show.
It is a real honor. And when I got this book, I said I need to get Paul on our show. So one of the burning questions I wanted to ask first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself and how on earth did you get involved with President Eisenhower's Close Encounters?
Well, I was born and raised in Cape Girardeau, which had the now more famous 1941 UFO crash just outside of town. My grandfather was a judge in town, and my father was about 6 years old. And some of the leading citizens in the community were Rush Limbaugh I and Rush Limbaugh II. And when I was growing up in Cape Girardeau, Rush Limbaugh, the famous broadcaster, was an obscure DJ on the radio in Cape Girardeau, and he was my little league umpire when I played baseball in the park. Who had any idea that he would go on to be so world famous? He passed away just about a month ago. I never met him as an adult, but he was right behind me calling the balls and strikes in a sport in Cape Girardeau. Well, I went to college there, and as I grew up, I did not hear about any UFO crash. It was only around the turn of the century, around the year 2000, I began to hear this story. So I thought, well, where is a book about this? I want to learn all about it. And I kept waiting, and years went by, and there was nothing. So I researched it and wrote Mo 41, The Bombshell Before Roswell. And it went pretty well, and I thought there's one other story that really intrigues me, and I've seen it in just like a paragraph in one UFO book or another, and they mentioned it for a couple of minutes on the famous American TV show Ancient Aliens, and it's about when President Eisenhower was called away from a golf vacation in Southern California to go out to an air base and meet friendly aliens. And I know that sounds pretty wild or like a silly fantasy to some people, but I always found it intriguing when I read this, and I thought, well, where's a book on this subject? I want a full-length book with every detail, and let's just see if that story's true. And again, I waited so long, I decided I'll write this thing myself. And as you may have noticed, I crammed in every little detail and piece of information I could find to make sure the readers get their money's worth. And it's going so well that we've got a TV production crew interested in turning this into maybe a documentary or a mini series. We're still negotiating that. So it'll be something to look for in the years to come.
That is amazing. Well done. Congratulations, Paul. That is fantastic. Now, I want to ask you some questions here. When and how did this story actually first break?
I would say that rumors began to circulate almost immediately, but they were what I would call low-key rumors. And then finally, they found their way to a mutual broadcasting system reporter, and he had his own radio show named Frank Edwards. Mm-hmm. And in the spring of 1954, a few months after the event, he went on the air and apparently discussed the Eisenhower encounter as best he knew it, and he soon found himself out of a job. I don't think it's a coincidence either. This was the top secret event, and he really wasn't supposed to know, and certainly not broadcasted to the nation. And so it also appeared in a 1954 October issue of Valor magazine. So there was a little talk about it back then in 54, and then it just kind of died away for a few decades. And then an eyewitness to the encounter of Eisenhower with these friendly beings spoke up around 1982, I believe it was. And he even talked about it to a British UFO enthusiast. And this made some headlines, including the American tabloid, The National Enquirer. And it was picked up and circulated in some newspapers at that time. And then again, the story just seemed to die away, and nothing much was done about it. And about 15, 20 years later, a few more tidbits of information came out. And I thought, again, somebody needs to put this all together and find out if this story is really true. So I did the best I could, and it was augmented by an American congressman who made a video. I think it was in 2010. His name was Henry W. McElroy. Mm-hmm. And he said, I've seen some classified reports when I was in government that said Eisenhower was contacted by the military, who said, we are in touch with these extraterrestrial beings, apparently through a high-frequency radio communication program, and they want to meet you. And the military said they felt it was safe and that this would be an acceptable idea, and Eisenhower went for it. This is according to the congressman. And he says, it's my understanding Eisenhower did go indeed meet with these aliens. So there's another clue to the puzzle that gives you a real cause of stopping and considering this seriously. Why would an American congressman risk his reputation with some wild claim or a lie that he made up and do it on a video for the world to see? So that was another indication that I really should take this seriously too, and I did, and I'm glad you liked the results.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, though, what fascinated me also, the main question was how it was done, how this meeting was set up. And does this mean that the military were experimenting with these channels or these communications, or did they receive these communications from the extraterrestrials themselves? I mean, how did that actually happen?
I confess I do not know who initiated the contact. I should imagine the extraterrestrials did. Yeah. As we get more into the story, we find that they had an urgent topic they wanted to discuss with the president. And that was a test program he was authorizing and guiding through, and it was a danger to the world. And they were obviously monitoring us and very concerned. So they probably initiated the high-frequency radio communication and a back and forth. And it was obvious as the president took office in January of 1953 that there was no evil alien intent. We were just fine. We're not going to be invaded. And that the extraterrestrials were at least benign, if not warm and friendly. So I think he cleverly set up and scheduled a vacation in Palm Springs, California, to be near a very remote air base called Edwards Air Force Base out in the desert, so that if aliens did come down and land during his golf vacation, almost no one would see it or know about it. This would be so far out in the desert, there would be no eyewitnesses. So Eisenhower just loved to golf. He was obsessed with the sport, and he loved going down to Augusta, Georgia, a few hundred miles from Washington, D.C., and golfing there. So it's very unusual, and it's a pretty telling factor that he scheduled a golf vacation 2,500 miles from Washington and just happened to be idling about playing golf when this event occurred. It seems pretty obvious this was a predestined or planned event, and this was the cover story that he just happened to be golfing in the community when these extraterrestrials landed at the airbase.
So building up to Eisenhower having his golfing vacation and some, interaction with extraterrestrials, as we call them, what actually happened? I mean, where did Eisenhower meet the extraterrestrials, and how did he know that this was all going ahead?
Well, according to what I've uncovered and been able to piece together, the extraterrestrials landed at the airbase on Friday, February 19th, 1954, in 5 different spaceships. 3 were circular or round disc types, and 2 were elongated, or what we call in America cigar-shaped, and outstepped extraterrestrials who looked a good deal like us. I call them cousins of human beings. They were slightly different, according to an eyewitness, but not much different. And they interacted with Air Force officials at the base who felt they're unarmed, they're friendly, they want to meet Eisenhower. This is what Ike set up his golf vacation for, so they called him, and he waited for the cover of darkness. There was a party for the media going on at a hotel in Palm Springs. I don't think that was a coincidence either. I believe that was part of the plan, and we'll discuss that a little bit more as the same thing happened the very next year. But in 1954, Eisenhower managed to slip out of Palm Springs, be flown out to Edwards Air Force Base, largely undetected, and that he went to an Air Force Base hangar where they kept jet planes, and he was surrounded by bodyguards at all times. And he waited, and the aliens stepped out and walked right up to him. I don't believe they shook hands or made any physical contact. And Eisenhower kept himself surrounded by 6 special bodyguards. And he spoke English, and they did too. The extraterrestrials had obviously been monitoring us. They knew about our language and our customs. And they had a very peaceful, friendly chat. And when it was over, Eisenhower swore everyone at the airbase to secrecy, said this is a matter of national security, and then he got back to his Palm Springs private home that was rented for him, and no one really was the wiser other than these what I call low-key rumors that came out afterwards.
Oh, that's incredible. I mean, that's just so fascinating. We'll get to the other really interesting, meaty bits in a little while. But there's also the question that it almost turned into a disaster even before the arriving aliens sat down to talk. I mean, what happened? What was the disaster?
According to an Army, or at least a military man, I'll put it that way, who was at the base, they were shooting live ammo at targets in the desert right near Edwards Air Base when the aliens came down. And a general who was monitoring their artillery practice, ordered them, to open fire on the alien craft, which were, I guess he did not have a clue they were coming and thought that it was an invasion of some sort. I'd hate to think that he knew that they were coming and he set a trap for them and decided to attack them, obviously without Eisenhower's approval. But at any rate, they turned their guns on these airships and fired artillery at them. The 5 craft had come down out of the sky, and their explosions, their detonations, had no effect whatsoever, according to this military man who spoke to a UFO researcher in Los Angeles shortly thereafter. He said that they opened fire, and the UFOs were completely unharmed, and just came down across the base at this air hangar on a runway, and they stopped firing on them and watched in just utter shock as these craft were probably very shiny and sleek and silent, with no propellers and no tail fin or exhaust pipe, just a round disc that seemed to defy our laws of gravity. So they were probably hustled out of there pretty quick, and I should imagine the general who ordered the open fire on them, I don't know for sure, but I'm sure he was dressed down by President Eisenhower after the event. I don't think that was authorized by the commander-in-chief whatsoever.
Well, you don't upset your supreme commander, do you? You don't upset the main man himself. And that's really interesting. And who else was at the secret meeting? Because I know that a lot of people have their own ideas of who was there, but and most people, the general idea that it was conducted in some kind of hangar. But who else was there with Eisenhower and the aliens?
There's a new independent film out by Christopher Munch called The 11th Green, and in it, he depicts the encounter from what he knew. I had no input in this movie, had no idea until it was finished that it was being made, but he included in his artwork for the movie men filming the event with movie cameras. And I feel, from what I have read and put in my book, that this is a true aspect of the story. It was so set up in advance that movie cameramen were there to record the big event. And I think that was for 2 reasons. One, to make sure if anything went wrong, someone in the military would have this record and be able to assess, where the aliens attacked or something. And of course, they did not attack. And the second reason might have been political, for Eisenhower to utilize the footage in any re-election campaign and say, look who came down to talk to me above and beyond all people on the face of the earth, your beloved president. Now, that footage was tucked away, and apparently only a few people have seen it. And I tried to give a description of what was unhatched or unleashed in classified files, that some of the footage was black and white and some of it was in color. But this gives us an indication, again, who was there and how it was set up in advance. The president obviously had Secret Service protection, but I think according to a United States Air Force test pilot who was called in to give his professional assessment of the craft coming down, that the president kept a bodyguard of about 6 men around him. And then I identify who they could be in the book, not by name, but by their law enforcement background, that they had protected Eisenhower so many times when he went to Augusta, Georgia, that records show a group, apparently a small group of Georgia State Highway patrolmen just happened to fly into Palm Springs and helped out with a special event on February 19th, 1954. Gee, what could that have been? So we got a clue there. And so the U.S. test pilot came in and said, I was a young pilot at the time. He was a colonel when in 1982 he spilled the beans on the encounter and said that they wanted my professional assessment of the craft. And I saw everything, and Eisenhower swore us to secrecy. But by 1982, he said, I was aware that everyone from that special group had died away. President Eisenhower died in 1969. So he wanted to get that story out, the pilot did, and he told it to a British member of parliament who was investigating UFOs and said, I want this story to go public, but I don't want my name released. It really did happen.
That's incredible. And, what we would do, Paul, yourself, many other people, myself included, my brother, my twin brother, that is, to see that footage would be absolutely incredible. Yeah. It's like the holy grail of everything. But one of the other things is I know that there's been a lot of controversy about did I was he visited by evil aliens or good aliens? And of course, there's always this twist and turn. But we know from your work, your research, that you found that they were very benevolent beings. But what exactly did they want from Eisenhower? What were they after? What was their visit all about?
That's a very good question. Why would they risk everything, even being fired upon their arrival, just to speak to Eisenhower? If you were an intelligent, advanced alien race capable of coming to this world and understanding our culture and our language, you would be aghast at the way we were treating the planet in the 1940s and 50s, with factories belching smoke and pollution and soot into the atmosphere, vehicles with their exhaust, and then worst of all, a new atomic weapons program with bombs being detonated in World War II in Japan twice, but then much bigger bombs were being detonated in testing around the globe, underwater, in the air, on the ground, underground. It was crazy the way we were recklessly setting off nuclear blasts just to see what would happen. We were like little boys playing with matches and gasoline at the time. So aliens were deeply concerned, according to what I read and put in the book, that we were polluting our planet and contaminating it with radiation and fallout, and it was leaking into outer space, which is more their territory, I guess. And they were deeply concerned and risked everything to go talk to Eisenhower and try to reason with him. The biggest test detonation of all was coming up just about a week and a half from the February 19th encounter. It was called the Castle Bravo atomic blast, and it was a disaster. If only Eisenhower had listened. It was an ecological, environmental disaster and contaminated people and fish in the Pacific Ocean. And it was far worse than American scientists figured it was going to be. And I just have to believe that aliens were aware that something like this was going to happen. And they pleaded with Eisenhower to please stop these atomic tests and stop proliferating the planet. Eisenhower was also authorizing shipping atomic bombs to various military sites around the world. And this was really triggering a huge arms race with Russia and England, and eventually France and China and other nations got involved, and they started arming their military bases with these deadly weapons, and it was becoming madness. So I think that is a very legitimate excuse to risk everything and come down and speak to the man in charge, the most popular and famous man in the world, President Eisenhower.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing I wanted to ask, Paul, is that there's been a lot of controversy about some kind of treaty with regards to the aliens and us. I mean, was there a treaty, or was it just, the spoken word and the visitors coming forward to address their concerns? One of the things I really want to ask you here is that did the aliens, as we call them, because I think alien is quite a harsh word, did the visitors say anything about where they were from, or, what star system they were from, or anything about their world to Eisenhower?
If they did, I was not able to uncover that. It was not stated by the test pilot, and I can't find it in a special document that was leaked in 2017, and I put it in the end of my book as an extra incentive for folks to read. It's a shocking, amazing document, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
It was a 1989 Defense Intelligence Agency briefing for, I believe, the new president of the United States in January, President Bush. And it talked about how back in the 40s we were experiencing UFO crashes, and finally Eisenhower himself spoke to aliens and formed an agreement. And that was basically to keep aliens from openly showing themselves. This was the upshot of the 1954 encounter. Eisenhower saw the alien ships and what they could do and said, we can't have this. You're going to have to leave, or at least keep yourself very discreet. If people in our society saw this going on, there would be a panic, and the stock market would crash and the economy would go down. This is at least what he felt would happen, and that there might be literally panic in the streets if you saw these discs and cigar-shaped craft defying our laws of gravity, or so we think, and flitting about in our skies, or landing openly and having aliens step out and try to talk to you. He thought this would be a disaster, and he may have been right. People just weren't open-minded at the time. It wasn't a mainstream topic for discussion or in the media. It was mostly like B movies, like The Day the Earth Stood Still. It was starting to become more thought of by UFOs and flying saucers, but that was still a little marginal in the press, that people were thought of as kooks if they saw a UFO. And so Eisenhower asked them not to show up. And that was part of the agreement, that the aliens said that, okay, we will agree to this if you let us come here and explore more privately at a secure area and take samples of flora and fauna as we study your planet. And Eisenhower said, as long as you don't start a panic, that sounds okay with me. So they formed an agreement, and I believe that was the cause of their encounter face-to-face the following year in New Mexico.
You know, when we think about it, going back, if we put ourselves in Ike's shoes, any one of us wouldn't know how to react. But I guess that when you're put in a situation where you're going to meet with visitors, and to him it was a very formal meeting, I think at that point you would just button up and be very professional about the whole thing. I just think it's amazing. I mean, all of us are like kids in a sweet shop wanting more and more. It's like incredible. But the other question is there any validity to the now legendary sudden dental emergency story with regards having to be rushed to a dentist because of I assume a chipped tooth or something?
Yeah, this was always bandied about in the stories that I used to read, the little paragraph or two in a book on UFOs, that they thought Eisenhower used this night as an excuse, that he had to run to the dentist when he was in fact healthy and was meeting with aliens. That story is, well, it's true. He did have a dental emergency, but that was not until the night after the Friday night encounter with aliens. It happened on Saturday night. He was chewing on a leg of duck that had been shot down that morning and roasted for dinner, and he bit into some buckshot and chipped a crown off a tooth, and he was in real discomfort. So a dentist was called, and at first the dentist didn't believe the President of the United States needed his help, and he just hung up the phone and went back to sleep that night. He thought, yeah, sure, the President needs me. He thought it was a hoax. So Eisenhower was growing more and more impatient, waiting outside this dentist's office with his tooth really starting to hurt him. And the host for the dinner had to call up the dentist and say, could you get over to your office? The president really is in need of treatment. He's waiting for you. Hurry it up. So eventually Eisenhower did receive treatment. There's a little paperwork on this at the Eisenhower Museum and Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas. And so it's a true story, but it really had nothing to do with the alien encounter the night before. The press has just got this a little mixed up. When you think about it, if a president was told, hey, aliens have landed, we need you right away, you would say to your hosts, wherever you are, I've got a little presidential business to take care of. I'll be back in a few hours. And that's all you need to tell people. You don't need to make up a silly story about, well, I need dental treatment. Bye. Yeah. That's too easily checked on. And people did check on it. And the story is actually true. It's just for a different night.
Yeah, and what's interesting, and we can be humored by this. I would have loved to have seen the look on the dentist's face when he saw Eisenhower waiting for him, and I hope that he had a steady pair of hands when he was going in his teeth, because mine would have been all shaking. So did Eisenhower have a previous experience with aliens or UFOs prior to 1954?
In 1997, I believe it was, a man wrote to the New York Post with an amazing story, and they printed it. They felt it was valid. The man says, I was stationed aboard the USS Franklin Roosevelt. an American warship that was tooling along in, I believe, the English Channel or just off the coast of France in January of 1952. Eisenhower was a general at the time. He had not even announced for president. In fact, he kind of scoffed at the idea. And then something happened to change his mind. Well, anyway, this man said, I was aboard the bridge of the warship, and General Eisenhower came up probably in a bathrobe and slippers and asked for some coffee in the middle of the night. There had been a big storm going on with thunder and lightning and rain and wind, and no one could sleep, so the men on the bridge chatted with General Eisenhower. And suddenly they saw this silver disc come down and hover over their ship. And it was easily seen, especially when lit up by lightning in the area. And they all stood there in amazement, staring at this obvious otherworldly craft. And no one said too much, apparently. But when the craft took off about at least 10 or 15 minutes later, this was not a brief sighting. I mean, they all just stood there and looked at this thing, probably fairly close up. Eisenhower said, well, don't talk about this. I'll look into it and I'll get back to you. The man who wrote the story said that Eisenhower never got back to them, and they kept the story quiet. But obviously, as you go on in life, as the decades roll by, you want to get this story out before it dies out. So he wrote this tale. And again, the New York Post felt it was strong enough to go with it. They felt that it was a true story. And it gives you an indication that Eisenhower had at least this knowledge of aliens. And we could even go back to a World War II story you might be quite familiar with Eisenhower and Churchill and an RAF bodyguard.
You'll have to refresh my mind there, Paul. I'm not too sure. Oh, is that did they take photographs of the event?
In 52, I don't know if they did or not. And certainly if they did, I would hope they would, instead of just standing there with their jaws hanging open.
Tell us about it. Tell us about it, Paul.
They did not print the photos in the article, and it would have been a huge story if they had photos. But back in 1941, or at least in the early 40s, during World War II, General Eisenhower was stationed in England. And there was some reports that came in about what they called then Foo Fighters, these discs or orbs or lights that were shadowing American and English warplanes that were going over the Channel and defending the British Isles. And according to a letter that surfaced in 1999, a British RAF officer told his family that he was a bodyguard for Winston Churchill, and he was right nearby when Churchill and Eisenhower were discussing this latest UFO report, or Foo Fighter report, of an airplane, British RAF, I think a bomber plane, if memory serves, was being shadowed very closely by this flying object. And Eisenhower and Churchill agreed, we've got to keep this hushed up. This is going to frighten people and maybe rattle their beliefs, and maybe they'll stop going to church and believing in God. And both men were very godly. We have to keep that in mind. Churchill and Eisenhower were both God-fearing Christians who attended church regularly, and they did not want anyone to have their faith shaken. And I think this was another factor in 1954, too, that Eisenhower became the first U.S. president to be baptized in office. He was a devout Christian and did not want any other belief by American people putting their faith in, alien beings, maybe treating them or worshiping them as gods. So he wanted that hushed up for that reason as well. So this may well have gone back to World War II when Eisenhower and Churchill wanted the story of otherworldly craft being hushed up and kept from the American and British public.
Yeah, well, the Foo Fighters were very famous, and I know that there's been a lot of controversy, but the evidence states that they were almost like, probes that were assisting or watching Allied aircraft. Most fascinating. I mean, within UFO research, a lot of this occurred really within the 40s and 50s. I mean, it's happening today, but again, they seem to have upped their program in how they shield or conceal themselves. That would make a lot of sense. So did Eisenhower have a similar ET experience after 1954?
According to the research of the late, great Art Campbell, a UFO researcher now passed on, he found a number of stories that he pieced together about President Eisenhower going on vacation to Georgia and then suddenly taking off in Air Force One and flying to New Mexico secretly on a weekend. And once again, he used the cover of a media party at a hotel in Georgia. And he snuck out during that time and flew to New Mexico. That would have been Holloman Air Force Base, where he landed Air Force One. And according to some eyewitnesses that Art Campbell gathered, he stepped off his plane, and two shiny silver discs came down out of the sky. And thankfully, this time they were not shot at, as far as I know. They were greeted a little more peacefully. One hovered in the air, and the other disc came down and landed on the runway. And apparently Eisenhower had some contact with aliens, and this lasted for a few minutes. One story says they saw this man that certainly resembled Eisenhower go into the alien craft and come out a few minutes later. So I think that if we can speculate logically, why would he do this 1 year after the Big 54 encounter in California? Well, if he had put together a written agreement and wanted it ratified by the extraterrestrials, they had to meet again and come to a signed formal treaty, which was not particularly enforceable by either side, quite frankly. But it was a loose agreement where the aliens would be able to come and visit us and monitor our plants and animals and our environment and human races of all kinds around the continents of the earth, and try not to show themselves. So that, according to one eyewitness, he saw the discs come down as he was climbing a telephone pole to do a repair on the telephone line, and he went scooting down from there pretty fast, just absolutely stunned, and told his family later. And there were other clues put together by Art Campbell that indicate that not only was Eisenhower there and met with him, he then went into the air base at Holloman and swore everyone on the base to secrecy just in case they had seen or spoken to someone who had seen this encounter, and said, you're not to talk about this. It's best for national security. And he apparently swore two different groups at two different times on the base, and finally took off in Air Force One for Georgia and got back to his quail hunting vacation, which again was probably another cover story for why he was away from the White House, to make these important encounters and come to some sort of solution that he felt was good for the country and good for the human race. And when you think about it, I think he probably did the right thing, asking these extraterrestrials as politely as possible, could you not show yourself and start a panic here? I think so much of the opinion at the time was shaped by the 1938 War of the Worlds broadcast in America, a radio show that recreated an alien landing. It was a complete work of fiction, but people reacted with panic and a few heart attacks, and they ran out in the street with guns looking for the aliens. And of course, it was all an overreaction and a misunderstanding, despite being told repeatedly on this radio show, it's just a play, folks, don't take it seriously. Some people did. So Eisenhower and the military probably considered that very strongly and decided, we've got to cover this up. We don't want to trigger a mass panic in every city across America by letting all this information out.
You know, it's very interesting because, Paul, with regards to the UFO events that you have covered, a number of them, not just, about the UFO that crashed before Roswell, but, had the military at that point been open about this may have led to a completely different understanding altogether. But it's got into a bit of a mess now, isn't it? Because we're now finding that, the military establishments and those that in the know are still adamant, along with the media outlets, to keep this all under wraps. And I agree with you. I mean, the public can't handle fuel shortage or food shortage. I mean, it's like watching a scene from one of our naturalists, Sir David Attenborough's programs, where everyone goes ape. So I understand from Eisenhower's perspective about what, you can't just change things because some visitors come forward and say, look, you're damaging this and you're doing that. What else could they do? Now, I think that's fascinating, and that would also clarify the confusion sometimes when people see like articles with regards to Eisenhower in Air Force One and these UFOs coming down, and then Eisenhower in a hangar, and of course the pictures that are, a lot of them are faked, obviously, within the media, with Eisenhower meeting with grey-like beings. But I assume that the entities that he met again at Air Force One in Holloman Air Force Base were the same as the ones that he'd met before. Is that correct?
I'm assuming that also.
Yeah.
They were, again, about 5 foot tall, apparently, according to a leaked Army intelligence manual on encountering UFOs and aliens, that they may have had like grayish or grayish yellow skin, but looked very much like humans. And there were other races coming here, and this is probably another factor for Eisenhower to ask them not to show themselves and don't start a panic with any part of America, or hopefully the rest of the world, is that if you let one race in and openly show themselves, would you be opening a Pandora's box, a real can of worms, that all kinds of creatures would start coming here, some of them not so benign and friendly or human-like, and they would be just shocking or even abusive, or maybe even try to take over. So it would be another factor in him saying, could you guys keep this in the can and, all sealed up and not show yourselves, any of you?
Oh, that's awesome. And also, is there a monument dedicated to the alien contact and what was learned from them?
I don't know if there definitely is, but in America, in the heart of Georgia, there's a special monument called the Georgia Guidestones, and they were built around 1979, 1980 by a mysterious unnamed source named R.C. Christian. That was the only name he wanted to give. And he said he was among a group of people who wanted to build this special monument with all kinds of complex mathematical features in it, and an inscription of about 6 or more languages, so it would be read by people around the world. And it was originally to be built in Augusta, Georgia. So we're thinking, a very advanced, complex monument. And that Augusta, Georgia, where Eisenhower practically lived away from the White House, they actually had a home for him there. It makes me believe that this was likely put together by this special group that protected the president and wanted to put up something to commemorate the grand visit and the encounter, but they didn't want to tell people, blatantly, openly what this was all about. They were only able to find some affordable land out in a cow pasture out in the middle of the state. It's the most obscure, strange thing you've ever seen. If you look up the Georgia Guidestones online, you'll see this big stone monument with like 5 pillars and one overhead. That might be a reference to the spaceships or the aliens, or the number of people who surrounded the president who met them. This is my interpretation. I cannot prove it, but it certainly fits with the overall story. As I put in the book, there's amazing facts about the monument that seem awfully otherworldly, not of man-made origin to me.
That's incredible. I have seen it. As I said, I've read your amazing book, and I'm just going to tell our listeners, you need to go out and buy this book. You'll be absolutely blown away. President Eisenhower's Close Encounters. Now, I know, Paul, that you are fascinated with the likes of Marilyn Monroe and John F. Kennedy, but a lot of people will ask, well, there's been a lot of controversy about the wonderful, brilliant Kennedy, as indeed most of your fine presidents were and are still to this day. But was there any truth about Kennedy, and did he have anything to do with ex-President Eisenhower, Palm Springs, a local airbase, and UFOs at all?
In March of 1962, President Kennedy was on a tour around the country, and he made sure to fly specially to Palm Springs, where he met with Eisenhower in a hush-hush meeting at the Eisenhower home on the 11th green of a golf course where he had retired. So nobody knows to this day what the two were talking about and why Kennedy had to go all the way out there to meet with him face-to-face. In rather secretive conditions. The two men had spoken on the phone a number of times and even met at Camp David. JFK was a young former naval officer, and Eisenhower was an older man and in the Army, and they didn't have much in common except they both were American presidents who had to deal in private with this alien visitation issue, and they really couldn't discuss it with anyone else. So there are a number of tales that I'm the first to admit are sketchy, that said JFK may have gone to an air base while he was in Palm Springs area and seen some extraterrestrial matters himself. And it makes you wonder because whenever Mr. Kennedy was in Los Angeles, he always stayed either at the Beverly Hills Hilton Hotel or with his brother-in-law, Peter Lawford, the famous British actor who was living in Santa Monica in a beautiful beach house where he used to rendezvous with Marilyn Monroe. And some say Marilyn spoke in private to some people she knew that she had learned that JFK had seen evidence for extraterrestrials. She told her friend Robert Slater, who gave an interview later in life, and that Marilyn said that JFK had visited some Air Force base out west, was how Miss Monroe put it, and seen the bodies of gray aliens with big bulbous heads and big black eyes, and that he had seen some crash recoveries. And so that's not proof. It's an allegation. It's like a third-hand story, but it's quite fascinating. And Eisenhower met with JFK, I think, on a couple more occasions. Kennedy flew out to Palm Springs, and one of them was just shortly before he was assassinated. So what was going on there, I don't know, but there's some really juicy, wild stories that floated about, and I put in my book. I can't verify them for you. There doesn't seem to be any paperwork or document mentioning this, but it's quite interesting, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And, you know, the world mourned when JFK was assassinated. It is the most horrific time for the world because he was a good man and he had fresh new ideas. And, you know, that is something that, unfortunately, you know, no one could stop. But that's another story in itself. That's like opening a can of worms in another area, not just the UFO research and the like as well, too. So the obviously your fascination with the president's meetings with extraterrestrials and Eisenhower and Kennedy, and then after Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson. What about Lyndon B. Johnson? What was that all about?
Well, here's another red flag for us. When I was trying to research what kind of treaty Eisenhower formed with aliens in '54, I once got on my Google search engine, it came back and said 10-year agreement. Well, I couldn't find any more about this. I was very frustrated. But guess who just happened to drop everything in Washington, D.C. and fly out to Palm Springs and meet with President Eisenhower in his retirement home on the exact 10th anniversary of the Eisenhower encounter and the treaty that he formed with aliens. Lyndon Johnson flew out there and met with Eisenhower in private a couple of times. And there were strangely 2 Air Force Ones out on the runway and some gaps in LBJ's schedule. And I even put together a source that researcher Linda Moulton Howe found, an American scientist, who said that there was another encounter with the president in 1964. And so it could have been that Lyndon Johnson used that time with or without Eisenhower to have his own little encounter. Again, these are sketchy rumors. We sure need more, but I put them in the book, and it seems to add up that perhaps after 10 years, the agreement needed to be updated or canceled or maybe renewed for another period of time. But that's a red flag to me that President Johnson just happened to show up at Eisenhower's doorstep February 19th, 1954. And so that went on. Eisenhower met with President Johnson on the 15th anniversary. Just happened to be at his door on February of 1968, I think it was. And I wish I knew more about that, but I think the dates and the encounters there between the two men are pretty telling for us today. And that leads us to the next president, doesn't it?
Yes, to Richard Nixon.
On February 19th, 1973, Richard Nixon is alleged to have met with comedian Jackie Gleason at Homestead Air Force Base. Again, an air base, an American president. There was a group of bodyguards around Nixon. And supposedly Gleason's wife, well, not supposedly, Gleason's wife for sure, said a few years later, Jackie came home that night and said that he had just been shown by President Eisenhower evidence for extraterrestrials and that he was quite shaken and he couldn't sleep or eat and he drank and smoked more than usual, and he was really upset that he found out that the American government was hiding this from the American people, that they really were in touch with aliens. And Gleason did not deny the story when confronted. He could have said, this is a lot of nonsense, but he refused to say anything. I found late in life he gave an interview to Playboy magazine, and he did say that he went to an air base and saw this evidence. But to back up a bit, in 1973, when I checked the records, Jackie was hosting a golf tournament in Miami, and Richard Nixon did show up and puttered around in a golf cart with Jackie for the press, and they were photographed together that very afternoon. I go to the Nixon Presidential Library records, and they stop as of about 8:30 that night. And it says, document removed from the files. You're not to know what happened next. All we know is that Nixon showed up for breakfast the next morning. So it all adds up that the Gleason story could well be true, that he was driven to the airbase where Nixon greeted him and showed him this evidence because Jackie was obsessed with UFOs. And in private, so many sources have said that he wanted to talk about UFOs and extraterrestrials visiting, that he had an enormous book collection, hundreds and hundreds of books on UFOs, and those are real. They were donated after his death to the University of Miami, and they can still be read in a special library where the books have been donated for the public. If they're in the area, they can go to this reading room and see Jackie's paranormal book collection. So it all adds up, and I've been working on a separate book on this. I don't know if I'll have enough material to flesh this out as a kind of sequel, but again, it makes you really sit up and ponder the Eisenhower story again more seriously when the Nixon-Gleason encounter happened on the exact 19th anniversary, February 19th, 1973. Something's going on in private with U.S. presidents and extraterrestrials, if you ask me.
Yes, well, it would make sense because during those days, I think it's far different to today where there is a lot of red tape that you have to get through. I think in those days when you were the President of the United States and the President of the United States said something, it will be done. And I think and feel that because with regards to Eisenhower, he was, he was around for quite a while, very much respected man. It would make sense for those that took the presence of Supreme Commander would need him as like a father figure or an advisory capacity, because, as a president comes in, they'll need some kind of understanding of what's going on, especially if there is a hidden agenda with regards to the visitor or alien hypothesis, that the human race, that Eisenhower knew that they were here, but that they had to keep themselves concealed. And I think that if anything would happen at a later date, if Eisenhower wasn't here anymore, then those presidents would have a problem knowing how to deal with it. So I can understand the meetings, and the way that you've crafted and pulled your book together is really awesome. And you'll laugh at this because I always wanted to write a book on Eisenhower, and I said to my brother, Paul's beat me to it, and he's done a much better job than I ever would have done because you have access to so much brilliant information. And there's one last question which is very interesting, and is there a connection to the Eisenhower E.T. Summit, and any Steven Spielberg movie?
I think there is. I strongly suspect it. And I've been told that Steven Spielberg is still interested in UFOs and ETs, but that he's done so many movies on this, he probably won't turn my book into a movie. I have a contact who talked to another contact and said Spielberg's probably done with extraterrestrials in the movies, which is very disappointing for me, but there are still other Hollywood producers. Well, anyway, in the 1970s, we all remember the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
Oh, you bet.
And on the research for this film, Steven Spielberg consulted with Dr. J. Allen Hynek, and I found an article that mentioned Hynek was aware of the Eisenhower encounter from 1954. I strongly suspect Hynek told Spielberg all about that encounter because Close Encounters was a movie about an Air Force base out in the desert. Aliens land and they interact with human beings and they're peaceful and friendly. And that Spielberg was only allowed to say so much back in those days. So he fictionalized a story where the Richard Dreyfuss character in the movie would go out to the desert and watch all of this and then come down and meet the aliens himself. But there's just so many coincidences in that movie. And in 1982, Spielberg made the movie E.T., which was about an alien who was left behind and contacted his race through like a radio program or a high-frequency radio communications device.
Yes.
And the aliens, came down and landed. Does that sound familiar too?
Yeah.
A few years ago, Spielberg gave an interview and admitted this story was true. He said in 1982, I debuted he didn't debut, but he ran the film E.T. the Extraterrestrial in the White House for President Reagan. And Reagan turned to him after the movie was over and said, there's a number of people in this room who know this story to be true. And the rumors of this leaked out for years, and Spielberg admitted a few years ago in an interview, the story is true. Reagan did tell him that in the White House, that the extraterrestrial landing and such and visitation and, things between humans and aliens interacting and ET, it's all factual. And that gives you another clue. There's more going on behind the surface, behind the scenes, and hopefully we'll learn about it someday. In America, the United States Congress has passed some legislation saying the Pentagon needs to open their files on UFOs and tell us all about it by something like June 1st of this year. So everyone's eagerly anticipating what we will learn from the Pentagon. I'm a little skeptical myself, but it would be wonderful to have the curtain drawn back on many cases, especially the Cape Girardeau crash of 1941 or the Eisenhower encounters of the 1950s. Anything from the past that they could reveal would be helpful and exciting. And in my research, I was very frustrated because everyone from that era is dead, and even their children in many cases are deceased. So that would be safe for them to open up and admit to, in my opinion. They may not want to reveal things that have gone on recently because of so-called sources and methods that they use to gather information on UFOs and aliens possibly landing, spy sources and cameras and people they have in place to report things. Their lives would be in jeopardy. But things from 60, 70 years ago, come on, let's open those files and show some support for this at last. What do you say?
Yeah, I agree with you there, Paul. Absolutely. I mean, it's the Holy Grail. The only problem is that we would all be out of a job.
We'd have more to talk about that.
I think we would. Generally, we would, because we want to know more about them and where they come from, and it will be a never-ending story with regards to the fascinating concept and the knowledge that you and I and many other people know that are really interested in this, that there are alternative dimensions of awareness, there are other worlds, and they have been coming here. And I think it's about time that they just opened their secrets and allowed people to see whether or not they like it or not. It's there. You can't change it any more than you can change the setting of the sun or the moon. But I have to say, we're coming to the end of this show, and what a show it's been. I've really enjoyed myself, and I'm so honored, Paul, to have you come on board. But how can people get hold of you? And before that, I need to ask, you did say you're working on a new book. Are there any more books in the pipeline?
I'm also working on a book about the forecasts that seem to be coming true from author Ruth Montgomery's Spirit Guides. And she issued these books in the 60s, 70s, and 80s talking about a time to come and also mentioning aliens are indeed landing here. And the Spirit Guides wrote through her to say also, interestingly, that Dwight Eisenhower really did meet with aliens. They were very friendly, and he should have released that fact before he died. Apparently, Eisenhower died in March of '69 without mentioning the encounter to anyone. Like a good soldier, he kept his mouth shut. So I've been working on that book and the Nixon encounter book, and I've got one on Marilyn Monroe and what really caused her death.
Yes.
And so I'm looking forward to getting those out in the years to come. And if anyone wants to get in touch, you can write to me through my website, www.mo41.info. And you can find me on Facebook. I got a special Facebook page on President Eisenhower's Close Encounters, especially. And I get occasionally some bits and pieces and some information that's most helpful, especially on the 1941 UFO crash from my hometown in Cape Girardeau, Missouri. So it's been really revealing, and a number of people are really into this now. It's not like the 40s or 50s. It's not so considered kooky. It's much more mainstream. There's been so many sightings, except for one person I know has not seen any UFOs or ETs. Me. People are surprised to find this out. I've never seen anything. I guess wow. I have a very sheltered life.
Well, when you see them at close range, and there's 3 of them hovering over your head, the last time was on the 9th of April 2016, that tells you for definite that they are here. So I just want to say a big thank you to Paul and tell our listeners that Paul Blake Smith's book, President Eisenhower's Close Encounters, his new book, because he's got other books that you can buy, is available and published by Foundation Books. You can get it on Amazon as ebook or paperback. And Linda Moulton Howe, the famous reporter and editor of the earthfiles.com, has said this book is a must-read for everyone and anyone who wants more truth about UFOs and ETs. So there you are. You couldn't have a better endorsement than from Linda Moulton Howe herself. So I just want to say a big thank you to you, Paul. And you've been an absolutely smashing guest. I mean, although I've read your book, I mean, the listeners will learn so much about your work and your research and the passion and drive that you have for it. And we would love to have you back on again when you bring out another book, because we've enjoyed it so much. And don't worry, we'll come looking for you. You don't have to look for us.
That sounds like a good plan. And for everyone listening, to go out and buy 20 copies. That sounds good. Even better idea. So I sure thank you for having me on the show.
And that is a pleasure also. And lastly, it's a very big book, and it's got a lot of information, pictures, documents. You will not be disappointed, ladies and gentlemen. So that brings me to the end of the show. Just want to thank Paul Blake Smith again, our great guest, the author of President Eisenhower's Close Encounters and numerous other books as well, and continuing his research on the UFO and ET hypothesis. Thanks to all our listeners for listening to the show. Stay safe and keep your eyes to the stars. You've been listening to Twin Souls in association with the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Stay safe and be well.